The fog over Lake Bolsena in the spring of 535 was as thick as soured milk, clinging to the dark water and hiding the shores of Martana Island. Here, far from the golden mosaics of Ravenna and the intrigues of the Roman Forum, the last of Theodoric the Great's bloodline was meeting her end in a secluded villa. Inside the thermal baths, amidst clouds of hot steam like the breath of a cornered beast, stood Amalasuntha, queen of the Goths and the Italics. The steam hid the fear in her eyes, but it could not muffle the sound of approaching footsteps, the heavy tread of men whose fathers and brothers had fallen by her secret command. These were not envoys, not guards. They were the ghosts of her past, come to collect a debt. They did not draw their swords. Gothic vengeance did not always need steel. In this fog, where the world had shrunk to a few blurred silhouettes and the frantic beating of a heart, the central paradox of her life was resolved. A woman who spoke 3 languages, who quoted Virgil and Plato, who ruled the most powerful barbarian kingdom in Europe, was trapped by an ignorant and greedy cousin she herself had placed on the throne. She had tried to save Rome, its laws, its culture, its soul. But in this final moment, there were no senators, no legions, no Byzantine diplomats to protect her. There were only rough hands closing around her throat and the cruel irony of fate. She was dying not because she was a barbarian, but because she was too Roman for the brutal new world she had so desperately tried to civilize. Her death became the stone that started an avalanche, one that would bury not only her kingdom, but Italy itself, plunging it into the most terrible war in its history. To understand how the queen ended up in this steam bath, this death trap, we must go back several decades and look at the world she inherited. Italy at the beginning of the 6th century was a ghost draped in purple. The eternal city, Rome, was no longer the heart of an empire, but a magnificent mausoleum where goats grazed among the ruins of the Forum, and the descendants of patricians told legends of former glory. Yet, under the rule of Amalasuntha's father, Theodoric the Great, Italy was experiencing an autumn renaissance. It was a world built on a brilliant and fragile compromise, a political oxymoron, a kingdom of Goths governed by the laws of Rome. Gothic warriors, Aryan by faith, with long hair and trousers, scorned by the Romans as barbarians, were the sword of this state, its army, stationed throughout the land. But the soul, the brain, and the nervous system of this kingdom remained Roman. Roman senators like Cassiodorus held the highest administrative posts. Roman lawyers delivered justice according to the Justinian Code. Roman tax collectors filled the treasury in Ravenna. Theodoric had created a system where 2 nations lived side by side but did not mix, like oil and water in the same vessel. To the Goths, war. To the Romans, administration. It was an attempt to unite the energy of a young barbarian people with the wisdom of a dying civilization. But this balance was unnatural, held together solely by the authority and iron will of one man, Theodoric. Beneath the thin gilding of peace and prosperity, the embers of mutual resentment smoldered. The Goths saw the Romans as soft and treacherous schemers. The Romans saw the Goths as nothing more than uneducated savages and heretics. Amalasuntha was born and raised on this tectonic fault line, and her entire life would become a desperate attempt to build a bridge over a chasm that grew wider and deeper with each passing year. Amalasuntha's entire life was spent in the colossal shadow of her father, Theodoric the Great, and this legacy was both her greatest strength and her fatal curse. Theodoric himself was a living paradox. A Gothic prince of the Amal line, sent as a child hostage to Constantinople, he grew up not in a tent, but in the marble halls of the imperial palace. He absorbed a respect for Roman law, order, and culture, but the blood of a barbarian warrior flowed in his veins. When he conquered Italy in 493, he did not destroy as other barbarians had. He became a restorer. He ruled from Ravenna not as a Gothic chieftain, but as a successor to the Western emperors, bearing the modest title of Rex, king, but conducting himself like an Augustus. He repaired aqueducts, restored public buildings, patronized scholars like Boethius and Cassiodorus, and issued an edict proclaiming, "Our aim is to establish such law that no one, neither Roman nor Goth, could wish for anything else." It was a utopia, a dream of harmony he tried to impose through the force of his authority. But toward the end of his life, even he, the great reconciler, faced the impossibility of this task. Gripped by paranoia, he executed his best Roman advisors, Boethius and Symmachus, on suspicion of treason and conspiracy with Constantinople. This paranoia became his testament. Amalasuntha inherited from him not only the throne, but also this fundamental fear, this knowledge that the two worlds he tried to stitch together could tear apart at any moment. She had seen how her father, the most powerful of the barbarian kings, could never fully trust either his Goths or his Romans, and she, his daughter, decided she would surpass him. She would not just maintain the fragile balance, she would create a new, single people. This ambition, born of love and admiration for her father, would be the cause of her downfall. She took his dream, but forgot to take his cruelty and his distrust, which were the very things that had allowed that dream to exist. The atmosphere of the era in which Amalasuntha was to rule was saturated with mystical fear and the expectation of the world's end. The Christian world was fractured by deep theological disputes, and the Arianism of the Goths, which denied that Christ was as divine as the Father, seemed a monstrous heresy to the Orthodox Romans and Byzantines. Every crop failure, every earthquake, every comet that streaked across the sky above Ravenna was seen not as a natural phenomenon, but as a divine omen, foretelling punishment for the rule of heretics. Chroniclers of the time, like Procopius of Caesarea, write of sinister portents that accompanied the final years of Theodoric's reign and his daughter's regency. There were tales of monstrous births, of rivers overflowing their banks, of statues weeping tears of blood. This apocalyptic backdrop exerted immense pressure on political decisions. For the Gothic nobility, all these calamities were a sign that the gods were displeased with their dalliance with Roman culture and Orthodox faith. For the Romans, it was proof that God had turned his back on Italy as long as it was ruled by Arian barbarians. Amalasuntha found herself at the center of this religious storm. Though an Arian by birth, she pursued a policy of religious tolerance, protecting the rights of the Orthodox Church. This enraged her own people, yet she never earned the full trust of the Roman clergy, who saw her as merely a cunning heretic. This climate of universal distrust and superstitious fear created fertile ground for conspiracies. Every decision she made was viewed through the lens of divine will or diabolical influence. She tried to appeal to reason, law, and the common good in a world that was sinking ever deeper into irrational terror, a world searching for someone to blame for its misfortunes. Her rationality and enlightenment, her Roman upbringing, made her an outsider, incomprehensible to both factions, who craved not compromise, but miracles and unambiguous divine signs. The foundation of Amalasuntha's tragedy was laid in her childhood, in a unique upbringing that made her a stranger among her own people. While an ordinary Gothic girl of noble birth would have learned to weave, manage slaves, and inspire her husband for battle, Amalasuntha grew up in a library. Her father, Theodoric, who saw the future of his kingdom in a synthesis of two cultures, gave his daughter an education that not every Roman aristocrat could receive. Her principal tutor was Cassiodorus, a refined Roman senator, orator, and historian who instilled in her mind all the wisdom of the ancient world. Under his guidance, she mastered not only Gothic, but also Latin and Greek. She read Homer and Virgil in the original, studied the works of Plato and Cicero, and grasped the subtleties of Roman law and the art of diplomatic correspondence. This forge of character molded her not into a ruler of barbarians, but rather a Roman Augusta, a princess from Constantinople accidentally born into a Gothic kingdom. She learned to think in terms of the state, not the tribe, of law, not tradition, of diplomacy, not brute force. But this education also became her golden cage. It distanced her from the Gothic aristocracy, who saw these Roman trifles as cunning, effeminate, and a betrayal of their ancestors' ways. For a Gothic warrior, skill with a sword was a virtue, while the ability to quote classics was a suspicious and unmanly pursuit. When Amalasuntha spoke, she constructed her sentences like a Roman orator. When she made decisions, she was guided by the logic of a Roman lawyer. This did not inspire admiration in her people, but alienation and suspicion. They did not see their queen, a warrior's daughter. They saw an educated Greek, a foreign woman who despised their customs. And in this, there was a grain of truth. Having received a Roman upbringing, she may indeed have begun to look down upon the coarse manners of her kinsmen, and this would become her greatest strategic mistake. Amalasuntha's first true test, where she had to confront the reality of Gothic politics, was her regency following Theodoric's death in 526. Her son, Athalaric, was only a 10-year-old boy, and the full weight of power fell upon her shoulders. Immediately, she took her first step, one that would define her entire future. She officially proclaimed a continuation of her father's policies, but with a distinct pro-Roman slant. She addressed the Roman Senate with a speech, written for her by Cassiodorus, full of exquisite compliments and promises to protect Roman laws and privileges. She returned the confiscated estates to the children of the executed Boethius and Symmachus, demonstrating a break with the paranoid policies of her father's final years. These actions were met with delight by the Roman aristocracy, but with icy silence from the Gothic nobility. The main conflict, however, erupted over the young king's education. Amalasuntha, true to her ideals, hired Roman tutors for Athalaric to teach him grammar, rhetoric, and law. She wanted to raise him not just as a Gothic chieftain, but as an enlightened monarch, a second Theodoric. But the Gothic military leaders, veterans of her father's campaigns, were enraged. In their eyes, she was turning the future king into a bookworm, a soft Roman who would be unable to lead them into battle. They demanded that Athalaric be raised as a Gothic youth should be, hunting, feasting, and learning to wield weapons in the company of his warrior peers. This dispute over one boy's education was, in fact, a battle for the soul of the entire kingdom. Amalasuntha, trying to find a compromise, showed her first sign of ruthlessness. Learning of a plot to remove her from power, she secretly ordered the execution of 3 of the most influential Gothic aristocrats. It was her first step into the world of Roman intrigue, and it showed she was willing to shed blood to protect her ideals. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. By eliminating her enemies, she only strengthened her reputation as a treacherous Roman woman and created blood feuds with their powerful families. Behind all of Amalasuntha's political decisions, her pro-Roman reforms and diplomatic games, lay one deep, almost fanatical idea, her secret and primary motivation. She sincerely believed that the Gothic people, her people, were standing on the edge of a precipice. She saw how other barbarian kingdoms, the Vandals in Africa, the Visigoths in Spain, were gradually decaying, losing their internal structure and becoming easy prey for stronger neighbors, be it the Franks or Byzantium. In her view, the only thing that set the Ostrogoths apart, the only thing that gave them a chance for a future, was the legacy of Rome, which her father had so wisely preserved. She believed that without Roman law, without the Roman administrative system, without Roman culture, her people were doomed to dissolve into history, remaining merely a savage tribe that had briefly conquered Italy. Her mission, as she saw it, was not just to govern a state, but to achieve the civilizational transformation of her people. She wanted to reforge the Goths, to combine their martial valor with Roman education and legality, to create a new, stable nation capable not only of surviving, but of leading the post-Roman world. This was an incredibly ambitious and even arrogant goal. In essence, she believed she knew better than an entire nation what was good for it. This conviction bordered on messianism and made her deaf to warnings. She did not understand that for many Goths, their barbarian identity, their language, their customs, their Aryan faith, was not a flaw to be corrected, but a source of pride, the very thing that distinguished them from the conquered Romans. In trying to save them, she was, in their eyes, trying to destroy them, to turn them into a semblance of Romans. This inner fire, this certainty in her own righteousness, drove her forward, compelling her to take risky steps, while simultaneously blinding her, preventing her from seeing that the road to the hell she was creating for herself was paved with the best of intentions. Upon assuming the regency, Amalasuntha dove headfirst into the great game and began to actively consolidate her power, relying on Roman institutions and personnel. Her court in Ravenna became a center not of Gothic military might, but of refined Roman diplomacy and culture. Her chief instrument was Cassiodorus, appointed to the highest post of Praetorian prefect. It was his pen that drafted the ornate and legally flawless edicts, letters, and speeches that were sent throughout the kingdom and beyond. Through these documents, Amalasuntha crafted the image of an enlightened and just ruler. She initiated a large-scale program to return lands to Roman senatorial families that had been illegally seized by the Gothic nobility in the final years of Theodoric's reign. This move was intended to strengthen her support among the Italian aristocracy, but every acre of returned land created a new enemy for her among the Gothic commanders, who considered these estates their rightful spoils of war. She also carried out tax reform, streamlining the collection of duties and making it more equitable for the Roman population, which had suffered from the arbitrary actions of Gothic garrisons. In foreign policy, she maintained an active correspondence with Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, addressing him in letters full of assurances of friendship and respect, written in impeccable Greek. She tried to position the Ostrogothic Kingdom not as a barbarian state, but as an equal partner, a younger sister to the Byzantine Empire. All these actions were logical from the perspective of Roman statesmanship, but catastrophic from the perspective of Gothic tribal politics. She was strengthening the administrative apparatus, but weakening her support within the army. She was winning the loyalty of the Romans, but losing the allegiance of the Goths. She was building the facade of a civilized state, failing to notice that its foundation, made of Gothic swords, was beginning to crack and crumble. Under Amalasuntha's rule, the geopolitical landscape of the Mediterranean began to shift slowly but inexorably, and her actions, aimed at strengthening her kingdom, paradoxically hastened its isolation. In Constantinople, the ambitious and tireless Emperor Justinian had ascended to the throne, obsessed with the idea of renovatio imperii, the restoration of the Roman Empire to its former borders. He and his wife, Empress Theodora, watched events in Italy closely, seeing the rule of a female regent and the internal division at the Gothic court as a unique window of opportunity. Amalasuntha, fully aware of this threat, tried to play a complex diplomatic game. She attempted to strengthen alliances with other barbarian kingdoms to create a unified barbarian front against Byzantium. She negotiated with the Frankish kings, offering them territorial concessions in Provence in exchange for guarantees of non-aggression. She maintained contact with the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, hoping for their fleet's support in case of a Byzantine invasion. However, her efforts were in vain. The Franks proved to be unreliable allies, taking the concessions but providing no real guarantees. And the Vandal kingdom, weakened by internal strife and religious conflicts, was itself on the verge of collapse. In 533, Justinian sent his brilliant general Belisarius to Africa, and the once mighty Vandal kingdom fell within a few months. This was a catastrophe for Amalasuntha. A Byzantine foothold was now in close proximity to Italy, in Sicily. The Mediterranean lake was once again becoming Roman, and the Gothic kingdom was caught in a strategic pincer. Her diplomatic network had collapsed, and she was left alone to face the rising power of the Byzantine Empire, whose emperor now looked upon Ravenna with a predatory gleam in his eyes. In this desperate situation, Amalasuntha made a move that seemed to her a tactical masterpiece, but in reality proved to be a strategic blunder that hastened the catastrophe. After the fall of Carthage and the Byzantine conquest of the Vandal kingdom, Emperor Justinian laid claim to Sicily, where the important Gothic port of Lilybaeum was located, which had previously been given to the Vandals as part of a dowry. Amalasuntha, realizing she could not defend the island by military means against the superior forces of the Byzantine fleet and Belisarius's army, decided to make a preemptive move. She entered into secret negotiations with Justinian and offered to voluntarily cede all of Sicily to him. In return, she asked for little formal recognition of her authority as the rightful ruler of Italy and guarantees of non-interference in the kingdom's internal affairs. From the perspective of Roman diplomacy, it was a brilliant move. She was sacrificing something small, what she couldn't hold anyway, to preserve the main thing, peace and the stability of her rule. She hoped this gesture of goodwill would satisfy Justinian's ambitions and turn him from an enemy into an ally. However, she made a fatal miscalculation, judging her opponent by her own standards. For Justinian, her concession was not a sign of strength and wisdom, but a manifestation of blatant weakness. He gladly accepted the gift, but had no intention of fulfilling his part of the bargain. The capture of Sicily only whetted his appetite and provided him with the perfect staging ground for a future invasion of Italy. But what was even worse was the reaction within her own kingdom. For the Gothic military aristocracy, the voluntary surrender of a strategically important island, a part of their conquests, was an indelible disgrace and an act of national betrayal. Rumors of her secret negotiations with Constantinople spread throughout the kingdom, confirming their worst suspicions. Their Roman queen was ready to sell off the lands of their ancestors in exchange for the Byzantine emperor's favor. This tactical masterpiece, became the final straw that broke the camel's back. In this critical period, Amalasuntha was surrounded by figures who personified the two poles of her fracturing world. Her only true ally and confidant remained the elderly Cassiodorus. He was her intellectual pillar, her voice, her connection to the Roman world. He sincerely believed in her mission, and until the very end, tried to frame her decisions in elegant prose and flawless laws. But Cassiodorus was a man of the pen, not the sword. He could offer wise counsel, but he could not lead an army. Opposing him was an informal but powerful coalition of Gothic military commanders, whose names history has only partially preserved, men like Tulum and Ibba. They were the embodiment of the Gothic spirit. Brave, direct, ignorant in matters of high politics, but possessing unquestionable authority among the warriors. They saw Amalasuntha and her Roman advisors as a threat to everything they valued: their warrior culture, their Aryan beliefs, their privileged position. They did not weave complex intrigues. Their methods were crude and direct, military rebellion. But her most dangerous enemy was one who combined the worst traits of both worlds. Her cousin, Theodoric, Duke of Tuscany, and the wealthiest landowner in the kingdom. He was not a warrior and was despised by the Gothic nobility for his cowardice and greed. But unlike them, he was educated, well-read, studied Platonic philosophy, and considered himself an intellectual. At the same time, he possessed boundless vanity and avarice. Amalasuntha, aware of his land-grabbing schemes, kept him under strict control, earning his bitter hatred. Theodahad was the perfect traitor. He was clever enough to plot in the Roman style and unprincipled enough to betray his own people. He lurked in the shadows, waiting for his moment, and it was he who would become the catalyst, uniting the brute force of the Gothic commanders with the cunning of Byzantine diplomacy to destroy the queen. The turning point that definitively undermined Amalasuntha's authority came when her son, Athalaric, reached adolescence. The Gothic nobility, outraged by his Roman upbringing, moved from words to action. A delegation of the most influential military leaders came to the queen in Ravenna, and in an ultimatum demanded that she be removed from her son's education. As the chronicles attest, their speech was full of barbarian directness. "O Queen, your manner of educating our king is unworthy. Letters make men timid and cowardly, and a ruler of the Goths must be a fearless warrior." Theodoric never sent Gothic boys to schools, for he said that he who fears the teacher's rod in childhood will never learn to look upon an enemy's sword without fear. They demanded that Athalaric be given young Gothic warriors as companions, so he would spend his time not with books, but in hunting and military exercises. Amalasuntha faced a terrible choice. To refuse meant provoking an open military rebellion, which, lacking the army's support, she would almost certainly lose. This would lead to civil war and make the kingdom easy prey for Justinian. To agree meant handing her son, and with him the future of the kingdom, over to her worst enemies. It would be a public admission of her defeat in the central cause of her life, creating an enlightened monarch of a new type. After agonizing deliberation, she chose what seemed to her the lesser evil. She yielded. She allowed them to take her son, hoping that by sacrificing his education, she could retain real control over the state apparatus and foreign policy. But it was a fatal mistake. By conceding on this fundamental issue, she demonstrated her weakness. Her enemies realized she could be pressured. Athalaric, freed from his mother's supervision, joyfully plunged into a world of drunken feasts and debauchery, encouraged by his new friends. Amalasuntha lost not only control over her son, but also her authority as an indomitable ruler. This was her crossroads of fate, and she turned onto the path leading to ruin. Despite this humiliating defeat over her son's education, Amalasuntha did not consider herself beaten. On the contrary, freed from the constant need to fight the Gothic nobility over Athalaric, she focused on governing the state with renewed energy. It was during this period that she perhaps reached the peak of her power, which was also the moment of her greatest pride, her hubris. She still controlled the treasury, the courts, and the entire civil administration. Her ambassadors still spoke in her name at the courts of Constantinople and the Franks. Sensing that her enemies, having taken her son, had calmed down, she decided to strike back. Learning of a new conspiracy being woven by the same aristocrats who had taken her son from her, she acted preemptively. She summoned them to her villas in different parts of Italy under the pretext of discussing important state affairs. And there, far from the capital, her loyal men killed them. It was a cold, calculated revenge in the best tradition of Roman and Byzantine politics. She eliminated her main opponents quietly, without trial or investigation, demonstrating that despite her love for the law, she was capable of acting by the laws of the wolf pack. At that moment, she must have felt all-powerful. She believed she had found the perfect formula for rule. Publicly, she was the enlightened, just philosopher queen, while in the shadows, she was a ruthless and effective politician, capable of eliminating threats. She had challenged fate, believing she could forever balance between these two roles, ruling barbarians with Byzantine cunning. But it was this very duality, this pride born of temporary success, that blinded her. She failed to consider that murdering 3 noble aristocrats had not solved the problem, but had only driven it deeper, creating a mortal hatred in their powerful families, who would now merely wait for a convenient moment for a blood feud. She had won a tactical battle, but strategically, she had lost the war for the trust of her people. The harbinger of the coming storm was the fate of her son, Athalaric. Freed from his mother's strict supervision and fallen into the hands of the Gothic nobility, the young king plunged headlong into the lifestyle they considered worthy of a true barbarian ruler. His new mentors encouraged not valor in him, but the basest of instincts. Athalaric's days and nights were spent in endless feasts, drunkenness, and debauchery. His frail constitution could not withstand such a life. What was normal for campaign-hardened veterans became a deadly poison for the pampered youth. Soon, he began to suffer from the effects of excessive indulgence, and his health was ruined. Procopius of Caesarea writes that he fell into a consumption. Amalasuntha watched in horror as her son, her hope, the future of the dynasty, and her entire project faded before her eyes. She tried to intervene, sending away his dissolute companions and summoning the best physicians, but it was too late. The process was irreversible. In this fading youth, she saw the collapse of all her plans. He was supposed to be the bridge between two worlds, but instead became a victim of their collision. He became neither an enlightened Roman monarch nor a strong Gothic warrior, but a weak-willed, sickly shadow. This was the first, fatal crack in the foundation of her power. Her entire legitimacy as regent was based on ruling in the name of her son, the future king. But now it was becoming clear that he had no future. Amalasuntha's enemies, both within the kingdom and beyond, eagerly awaited the extinguishing of this fragile life to pounce on the orphaned throne. Athalaric's fate became an ominous symbol of the fate of her entire endeavor, a beautiful idea destroyed by harsh reality. The fatal act that set in motion the irreversible chain of events leading to catastrophe occurred in the autumn of 534. Athalaric died before reaching adulthood. With his last breath, the entire legal structure of Amalasuntha's power collapsed. She was no longer a regent. She was simply the daughter of a deceased king, a woman without a throne, without an heir, and without any legal right to rule alone in the patriarchal Gothic society. Power was slipping through her fingers like sand. The Gothic nobility, who had tolerated her rule only out of respect for her Amal blood and her status as the king's mother, were now free from all obligations. Amalasuntha faced a dilemma with no good solution. She could try to rule alone, but that would inevitably lead to rebellion and civil war. She could flee to Constantinople for Justinian's protection, but that would mean losing everything she had fought for and betraying her father's memory. Or she could try to find a way to hold on to power by forging a risky alliance. And it was in this moment of desperation that she made her most fatal miscalculation. She decided not to fight, not to flee, but to outwit everyone. She needed a man on the throne, a Goth of the Amal line, to give her rule legitimacy. And her choice fell on the only suitable candidate, her cousin, Theodahad. She knew of his greed, vanity, and untrustworthiness, but she believed these very qualities made him the perfect puppet. She thought she could control him, tempting him with money and honors while keeping real power in her own hands. This was the turning point, the point of no return. In a desperate attempt to keep the crown, she placed it on the head of her own future murderer. Amalasuntha's desperate gambit was conceived in the spirit of the most sophisticated Byzantine intrigues. She invited Theodahad, her worst enemy, to Ravenna, and offered to make him her co-ruler, king of the Goths and Italics. But there were conditions. She demanded he take a sacred oath on the Gospels that he would be content with only the royal title and outward honors, never interfering in the actual governance of the state, leaving all power in her hands. In return, she promised him immense wealth and protection from accusations of corruption. To Theodahad, who had dreamed of the crown his whole life but was afraid to fight for it, the offer seemed a gift from heaven. He took all the required oaths without hesitation. Amalasuntha was certain her plan would succeed. She had underestimated her opponent, seeing him only as a greedy intellectual, not a ruthless predator. She relied on the sanctity of an oath, on the Roman concept of law and contract, while Theodahad viewed the oath as merely an inconvenient formality, a stepping stone to absolute power. To be safe, she even entered into secret negotiations with Justinian's ambassador, informing him that if her plan with Theodahad failed, she was prepared to hand over the entire Italian kingdom to the emperor's authority. This was an act of extreme desperation, her plan B, which showed just how precarious her position was. She was trying to play on all boards at once, making alliances with her enemies while holding secret talks with foreign powers. But, entangled in her own webs, she only gave all her adversaries new trump cards and reasons to accuse her of treason, not understanding that in this game, those who leave themselves paths of retreat are the ones who lose. The moment the crown touched Theodahad's head, he forgot all his oaths. The snake that Amalasuntha herself had placed on the throne immediately began to strike. He understood that as long as Amalasuntha was alive, enjoying the support of the Roman aristocracy and her connections in Constantinople, his own power would be a phantom. He needed to destroy her, but in a way that wouldn't provoke an immediate invasion by Justinian. And so he began to weave a double intrigue. First, he secretly contacted the Gothic aristocrats, whose families had suffered from the executions Amalasuntha had ordered. He began to turn them against the queen, whispering that she was still in charge, that she despised them and could strike again at any moment. He fueled their thirst for a blood feud, promising them his support when the time came. Simultaneously, he started his own game with Constantinople. He met secretly with the Byzantine ambassador, Peter the Patrician, and laid out his plan. He offered Justinian a deal far more advantageous than the one Amalasuntha had proposed. He was willing not just to recognize the emperor's suzerainty, but to cede Italy entirely, asking only for a huge sum of money and an estate in Constantinople where he could live out his days in philosophical peace. It was the offer of a coward and a traitor, but for Justinian, it was perfect. He now had two contenders ready to give him Italy, and he could simply wait while they destroyed each other. Theodahad, thinking himself a brilliant schemer, had in fact become a mere pawn in the hands of a far more skillful player. He thought he was buying himself a safe future, but in reality, he was signing the death warrant not only for Amalasuntha, but for the entire Ostrogothic Kingdom. Theodahad's actions did not go unnoticed in Constantinople. Emperor Justinian and his perceptive wife, Theodora, got exactly what they had been waiting for. The internal schism at the Gothic court had reached its peak. They held two mutually exclusive offers, one from a legitimate but weakening queen, the other from a usurper ready for total betrayal. Justinian, a master of Byzantine diplomacy, decided to exploit the situation for maximum gain. He did not openly support either side. Instead, he sent his most experienced diplomat, Peter the Patrician, to Ravenna with highly ambiguous instructions. Officially, Peter was to express support for his ally Amalasuntha and demand that Theodahad respect her rights. This created an image for Justinian as a noble defender of justice. But unofficially, Peter's mission was to inflame the conflict, give false hope to both sides, and closely monitor developments. Justinian understood that a living Amalasuntha, even if she handed him the kingdom, would remain a problem. How to rule the Goths through her. A dead Amalasuntha, however, was the perfect pretext for war. A casus belli that would look like just retribution and be supported by the Roman population of Italy. Constantinople began to move troops to the borders. The army of Belisarius, fresh from its victory over the Vandals, stood at full readiness in Sicily. A fleet was assembled in the ports of Dalmatia. Justinian was in no hurry. He was waiting. He was waiting for the Goths themselves to make the fatal mistake that would untie his hands. The whispers from Ravenna had become an invitation to bring Italy back into the fold of the empire, and he was ready to pay any price, using the lives and ambitions of the Goths as currency in his great game. While the Goths plotted and the Byzantines waited, a third power on the Italian peninsula, the Roman aristocracy and the papacy, made its own pragmatic choice. The very senators to whom Amalasuntha had returned lands, the very popes whose rights she had defended against the Arians, betrayed her at the crucial moment. For them, Amalasuntha had always been a compromise, the lesser of two evils. She was a barbarian and a heretic, albeit an educated and tolerant one. The prospect of reunification with the Eastern Roman Empire, with a co-religionist, Orthodox emperor in Constantinople, was incomparably more attractive to them. They were tired of being ruled by barbarians, even civilized ones. They dreamed of a return to the old order, of the restoration of unity between empire and church. As soon as rumors of the schism at the Gothic court and Justinian's impending invasion reached Rome, they began secret negotiations with Byzantine agents. Pope Agapetus the traveled to Constantinople in person, officially on a peace mission on behalf of Theodahad, but in reality, to negotiate the terms of Rome's liberation. The senators, whom Amalasuntha had considered her main support, saw in Justinian the true defender of their interests and of Roman civilization. It was the ultimate irony. The woman who had sacrificed everything to save the Roman heritage was betrayed by the very bearers of that heritage. They did not appreciate her sacrifice. To them, she was merely a temporary steward in their house, and now that the true master had appeared at the door, they were ready to open the gates for him, even if it meant stepping over the corpse of their benefactress. Her dream of a harmonious synthesis of two cultures was shattered by the cold pragmatism of the Romans, who, in the end, would always choose their own. Sensing the ground shifting beneath Amalasuntha's feet, and having secured the tacit support of Constantinople and the Roman Senate, the Gothic nobility went on the offensive. The families of the three aristocrats executed by the Queen years earlier now formed the core of the conspiracy. For them, this was not just politics, but a matter of a blood feud, a sacred duty to their kin. They went to Theodoric, no longer as supplicants, but as allies, and demanded decisive action. They provided him with the army he never had, and he provided them with the royal sanction they lacked. This alliance of vengeance and ambition proved deadly. Theodoric, who had feared Amalasuntha himself, now found his confidence. He had acquired the brute force he so desperately needed. Together, they devised a plan. It was necessary not just to kill the Queen, but first to completely discredit her, strip her of all support, and portray her as a traitor in the eyes of the few Goths who still remained loyal. They began to spread rumors that Amalasuntha had been in secret negotiations with Justinian from the very beginning of her reign to surrender the kingdom. Her pro-Roman policies, her concession of Sicily, her correspondence with the emperor, all of this was now presented not as an attempt to save the kingdom, but as links in a single chain of high treason. It was a cynical and brilliant lie, because it so closely resembled the truth, based on real facts torn from their context. The Gothic nobility's revenge was not a simple act of violence. It was a well-planned political assassination, where the reputation was murdered first and the body second. The trap, so long and carefully prepared from all sides, finally snapped shut. Having consolidated his position, Theodoric moved to open action. He convened a council of the Gothic nobility in Ravenna, to which Amalasuntha was also invited. There, before the faces of those who just yesterday had sworn loyalty to her and her son, he made his formal accusation. It was irony incarnate. Theodoric, who had just offered to sell the kingdom to Justinian, now grandly accused Amalasuntha of conspiring with Constantinople. He claimed to have irrefutable proof of her treason. He used her letters to the emperor, her concession of Sicily, her secret talks with the ambassador as evidence in this show trial. Amalasuntha's arguments, her attempts to explain that all this had been done to save the kingdom, were no longer heard. The verdict had been decided in advance. The Gothic aristocrats, thirsting for revenge, supported the accusation with thunderous cries. Those who hesitated chose to remain silent, fearing they would share her fate. Her Roman advisors, including Cassiodorus, were powerless. In that moment, Amalasuntha found herself in complete isolation. No one came to her defense. All those she had counted on, the Gothic army, the Roman Senate, the Byzantine emperor, had either betrayed her or were silently watching her fall. She lost not because her enemies were smarter, but because they were more united in their hatred than her supporters were in their loyalty. The charge of treason, brought by the chief traitor himself, became the culmination of the absurdity and tragedy of her reign. After the farcical accusation, Amalasuntha's fate was sealed. Theodahad, however, did not dare to execute her immediately in Ravenna. He still feared Justinian's reaction and wanted to create a semblance of legality. It was decided to send her into honorable exile. A small island, Martana, situated in the middle of the volcanic Lake Bolsena in Tuscany, on lands belonging to Theodahad himself, was chosen as her prison. The choice was symbolic. Her jailer was the very man she had made king. The journey into exile was the queen's final humiliation. She was transported under guard through the lands she had once ruled, past the cities she had improved. She saw the faces of her subjects, Romans and Goths, and in their eyes she read either fear or gloating or indifference. On the island, a comfortable house was prepared for her, and she was assigned servants. It was a gilded cage, designed to lull her vigilance and to show the outside world the humanity of the new king. Theodahad sent letters to Constantinople, assuring Justinian that Amalasuntha's life was not in danger, that she was simply temporarily removed from affairs for the sake of stability in the state. The world held its breath, watching the drama unfold. Everyone understood this was merely the prelude to the finale. The island of Martana became the stage upon which the final act of the tragedy was to be played out. Amalasuntha, cut off from the world, deprived of communication and support, was transformed from a queen into a hostage, her life a bargaining chip in the great political game between Ravenna and Constantinople. Emperor Justinian's reaction to Amalasuntha's exile was a model of Byzantine hypocrisy and political calculation. Upon receiving news of the queen's arrest, he publicly expressed extreme outrage and indignation. He sent Theodahad a furious message, calling Amalasuntha his dear sister and ally, and demanding her immediate release, threatening the most severe consequences otherwise. To back his words with action, he urgently dispatched his best diplomat, Peter the Patrician, to Italy with the official mission of securing the queen's freedom. This entire diplomatic spectacle was designed for the Roman population of Italy and the whole of Christendom. Justinian was crafting an image of himself as a noble defender of legitimate authority and an innocent woman who had fallen victim to a usurper. But behind the scenes of this public drama, a very different game was being played. Justinian knew perfectly well that his threats would only push the frightened Theodahad to more drastic measures. He knew that a dead Amalasuntha would give him a much better reason to start a war than a living but humiliated one. The embassy of Peter the Patrician moved towards Italy with deliberate slowness. The emperor was giving Theodahad time to do the irreparable. The emperor's shadow loomed over Italy. He did not want to save Amalasuntha. He wanted to avenge her. And under the pretext of this revenge, to reclaim the most precious jewel in the crown of the ancient empire. He used one woman's tragedy as a key to open the gates for his legions, who would bring Italy not liberation, but devastation and death. Amalasuntha's final days on the island of Martana were filled with a mixture of fear, despair, and fading hope. In complete isolation, she likely felt, for the first time in her life, utterly powerless. All her learning, her knowledge of languages, her diplomatic talents, all were useless in her gilded cage. From the shore of her island, she could see the beautiful landscapes of Tuscany, the lands she once ruled, but could not reach them. According to some sources, she was allowed to correspond. Perhaps she wrote desperate letters to Justinian and Theodora, reminding them of their oaths and alliance, pleading for help. She clung to the hope that the Byzantine ambassador would arrive in time, that international pressure would force Theodahad to back down. She still believed in the power of words, law, and diplomacy. Thinking like a Roman, she could not fully accept that the Gothic nobility and her own cousin were capable of such blatant, lawless violence. Every day, she must have scanned the horizon, hoping to see the sails of a Byzantine ship. But days turned into weeks, and no help came. Hope gradually gave way to the realization of the inevitable. She likely analyzed the chain of her mistakes, her trust in Theodahad, her underestimation of the Gothic nobility's hatred, her excessive faith in the support of the Romans. In those final days, she may have understood the full futility of her grand project. The bridge she had worked so long to build between two worlds had collapsed, and she herself was buried beneath its ruins. She had tried to play a complex game by the rules of civilization, not understanding that her opponents had long since abandoned all rules. While the Byzantine ambassador Peter the Patrician traveled slowly on his way to Italy, Theodahad realized he was almost out of time. The ambassador's arrival would mean for him either the humiliating necessity of releasing Amalasuntha, which would inevitably lead to his own downfall, or an open conflict with Byzantium, for which he was not prepared. In a panic, he decided to act preemptively. He gave the order that would forever inscribe his name in history as that of a traitor and murderer. But he did it with his characteristic cunning. He did not send his own soldiers. He summoned the relatives of the very same three Gothic aristocrats whom Amalasuntha had once secretly executed. Among them was the son of one of the victims. Theodahad gave them the unique opportunity to carry out the blood feud they had so long desired. He gave them not only permission, but the royal blessing to kill the queen. In this way, he solved several problems at once. First, he got rid of Amalasuntha. Second, he did it at the hands of his allies, forever binding them to him with blood and making them accomplices to the crime. Third, he could at any moment claim that it was not an act of state, but an uncontrollable outburst of personal vengeance, which he had been unable to prevent. The order was given. A group of assassins set out for the island of Martana. Their task was not just to kill, but to do so before Byzantine ships appeared on the horizon. The queen's fate was decided not in a throne room, but in a coward's whisper and a conspiracy born of greed, fear, and revenge. The end came on the 30th of April, 535. The assassins arrived on the island and found Amalasuntha in her bath. The place of her death was monstrously symbolic. The thermae, the baths, were a symbol of the Roman civilization she had so loved and tried to preserve. And it was here, in this bastion of Roman life, that barbarian vengeance found her. Her death was not that of a warrior on the battlefield or an execution on the scaffold. She was simply strangled in the hot steam, like a slave. This ending, devoid of all grandeur, was the cruelest and most ironic answer to the central question of her life. Her attempt to save Rome in a Roman way, through complex political combinations, secret orders, alliances, and compromises, was what ultimately led her to this defenseless situation. Had she ruled like a true barbarian queen, relying on brute force, the loyalty of her warband, and the laws of the tribe, she might have survived. But she tried to be too Roman. She trusted a traitor's oath, hoped for the protection of a distant emperor, and underestimated the primal force of a blood feud. She became an outsider to the Goths, who saw her as a betrayer of their traditions, and she never became one of the Romans, who at the decisive moment chose a more powerful patron. She was strangled by the hands of Goths, but the ideological accomplices to this murder were everyone: the treacherous Theodahad, the hypocritical Justinian, and the pragmatic Roman Senate. Her death marked the end not just of a woman, but of an entire idea, the idea of the possibility of a peaceful synthesis between two worlds. Amalasuntha's death became the very pretext Justinian had been waiting for. As soon as news of the murder reached Constantinople, the emperor donned mourning clothes and delivered a fiery speech to the Senate, branding Theodoric a vile murderer and vowing to avenge the death of his innocent ally. The diplomatic games were over. War had begun. Within just a few weeks, the Byzantine fleet under the command of Belisarius landed in Sicily, which the Goths did not even try to defend. The army then crossed to the mainland. The Gothic Wars began, one of the bloodiest and most destructive conflicts in European history. The war, which formally began as revenge for one woman, lasted for nearly 20 years, from 535 to 554. It swept across Italy like a fiery maelstrom, from the Alps to Sicily. Rome changed hands several times and was almost completely destroyed. The population of Italy was decimated. Prosperous cities were turned into ruins. Aqueducts were broken, and fields were abandoned. In the end, Byzantium was victorious. The Ostrogothic Kingdom was annihilated, and the Gothic people practically vanished from the pages of history. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Italy that Justinian recovered for the empire was no longer a flourishing garden, but a scorched wasteland. The paradox of history was that the civilized Byzantines, who came to save Italy from the barbarians, inflicted far more damage than all the previous barbarian invasions combined. And the trigger for this catastrophe was the death of a queen who, more than anything, had wanted to prevent war and preserve peace. Amalasuntha's legacy proved to be tragic and multifaceted, reflected differently in the mirrors of different cultures. To her own people, the Ostrogoths, she was remembered as the Roman woman, a traitor who, for the sake of her alien ideas, weakened the kingdom and led it to its doom. In their oral tradition, which has not survived, she was likely demonized as a woman who forgot the ways of her ancestors. For the victors, the Byzantines, she became a convenient propaganda tool. Historians like Procopius of Caesarea, writing on the emperor's commission, created an image of a noble and enlightened martyr, a victim of barbarian treachery. This image justified the conquest of Italy, presenting it not as an act of aggression, but as just retribution. For the Roman population of Italy, she remained an ambiguous figure. Some remembered her as a defender of their laws and culture, others as an Arian heretic, whose rule was merely a temporary respite before the return to the authority of the legitimate emperor. But for all of subsequent history, she became a symbol of a tragic utopia. She became the eternal what if. What if her project had succeeded? Could a new Romano-Germanic civilization have arisen in Italy that would have changed the entire course of European history? Her dream of synthesis, of merging the energy of barbarism with the wisdom of civilization, was buried under the ruins of Rome. But the dream itself proved incredibly resilient. Nearly 300 years later, another barbarian ruler, Charlemagne, would attempt something similar in creating his empire. In this sense, Amalasuntha was his distant and tragic forerunner. So, why did her aspiration to be too Roman prove fatal? The answer to this paradox is multi-layered. First, she tried to impose a Roman model of governance based on law, bureaucracy, and diplomacy on a society whose structure was held together by entirely different principles: personal loyalty to a chieftain, a military hierarchy, and traditions of blood feuds. Her Roman methods were effective in managing the Roman population, but utterly failed with the Gothic military elite, who saw them only as weakness and cunning. Second, by relying on the Romans and seeking an alliance with Constantinople, she deprived herself of the only real power base she had, the Gothic army. A queen of barbarians cannot rule without the support of her warriors. In trying to appease her enemies, she alienated her only potential defenders. Third, she fell victim to the geopolitical situation. Her kingdom was caught between the hammer of the resurgent Byzantine Empire and the anvil of other barbarian kingdoms. In this situation, only a predator could survive, and she tried to be a diplomat. She was playing chess on a board, where everyone else was knocking over the pieces and fighting with knives. She was too civilized for an age of barbarians and too much of a barbarian for an age of empires. Her tragedy was that she was a bridge, and the era demanded not bridges, but walls. And like any bridge that two hostile armies try to cross at the same time, she was destroyed. Amalasuntha's story extends far beyond the political biography of a 6th century queen. It is a universal myth about the tragedy of an idealist trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. It is the tale of a reformer who was ahead of her time and was torn apart by the forces of the past she tried to overcome. Her story is a timeless reminder that grand civilizational projects, dreams of cultural synthesis, of harmony between the old and the new, often shatter against the most base, yet most powerful, of human feelings. Tribal hatred, religious intolerance, greed, and the lust for power. Amalasuntha tried to save the soul of Rome, but she failed to account for the fact that the soul of her own people was no less important to them. She wanted to give the Goths a future, but they preferred to cling to their past. Her fate reflects, as in a drop of water, the entire drama of transitional eras, when the old world is already dead and the new one is not yet born. And in this twilight space, those who try to hasten the dawn are the ones who perish. Her murder in a misty bathhouse on a secluded island was not just the end of one life and one dynasty. It was the symbolic end of the entire era of late antiquity, the last desperate attempt to preserve the unity of the Romano-Germanic world. After her, all that remained was war, ruins, and a bitter lesson. The noblest of intentions can pave the road to the most terrible of hells, especially when the one who carries them is tragically alone in their vision of the future.